Resuming debate, reprise de débat, the honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Speaker, and I'm pleased to rise and speak to the main estimates tonight and pick up on a theme of the discussion so far, at least for part of the evening, on the topic of the estimates and particularly estimates reform and how we could do a better job of bringing financial transparency and therefore also accountability to Parliament. It was a theme of the President of the Treasury Board early on in the mandate. It was something that he reached out to talk to other parties about. And he even presented a briefing package on some ideas that he had for reform and how to address some of the problems which have to do with a number of things. In some cases it's the alignment, as we've discussed tonight, between the budget document and the estimates documents. There's also a difference in the way that the accounting is performed for each document. So the budget is done under accrual-based accounting, whereas we have cash accounting in the main estimates. There's also sometimes confusion around for parliamentarians, for instance, on some of the line items because they're not attached to particular programs. So these are all issues that were identified by the President of the Treasury Board with some proposals to fix them. What was odd was that when the proposal came for how to move forward, and I would note, along with my fellow Treasury Board critic from the Conservative Party, who noted that actually a lot of these reforms really are things that need to be done administratively by government. They're not things that require a legislative fix. So what was odd was that the beginning of this process and the beginning of this reform, if you look at his reform package as a whole, it's really not a bad package, and I think it's fair to say that if you could adopt it holus bolus, it would move us in the right direction in terms of better financial, in terms of parliamentarians and Canadians being able to understand Parliament's financial documents better, and therefore provide more openness and transparency. But the proposal for moving forward ended up being not the kinds of things that government can do administratively that are ultimately required in order for those reforms to be a success. But the first ask was that we change the standing orders to simply allow the main estimates documents to be tabled later. So that in and of itself doesn't provide any guarantee of better financial documents that are easier to read. It doesn't provide a guarantee that the budget and the estimates are going to align. It simply allows the government to take more time to table the main estimates, which may well be used by a sincere, well-meaning government in order to make those documents cohere, but by other kinds of governments that we've seen in this place from time to time, that might be abused. And so it's hard to understand why it is that with a well-outlined program for reform, the only thing that the government seems at the moment to be trying to aggressively advance, and I think in some ways putting the cart before the horse, is the one thing that actually diminishes accountability unless there's a lot of serious follow-up from the government. And I think we have cause to be skeptical at this point in the government's term about their good faith with respect to these kinds of things. And I think the mood here, rightly, is far more skeptical about their commitment to openness and transparency than it was at the beginning of the term. I offer up the example, Madam Speaker, of Glenn McGregor, who's a reporter from CTV, who recently asked under an access to information request to get an itemized list of the number of staff, not the particular staff in the Prime Minister's office, but the number of staff overall in the Prime Minister's office and their salary range. And what he got was a list with every single name blacked out. That's hardly a step in the direction of accountability and transparency. So when you have the President of the Treasury Board come to you and say, hey, we want you to trust us and consent to backing up the date for the tabling of the main estimates because we believe in being more open and we believe in being more transparent, and then you see reporters getting answers that clearly fly in the face of openness and accountability with respect to, in this case, the Prime Minister's own office, just wanting to know how many people are employed by the Prime Minister in his own office and what's their pay range, not the specific people and the specific pay, but how many people and what's their pay range. then I think you have a reasonable cause to doubt the sincerity of the government when they ask for that change. Madam Speaker, this was the same tactic used by the Harper government when they were asked similar questions about the PMO. So we have a government elected saying that they were going to make changes, that they were going to get more transparent, provide more accountability. They're asking us to change the standing orders in a way that without a sincere government would actually just simply reduce time for scrutiny, and then they go and they pull stunts like that, where they're not actually providing, when they easily could, legitimate information about their staffing and what they're spending. So it gets hard to trust them on that. When we talk about transparency and spending, the other thing that this government is becoming notorious for doing is making big funding announcements but back-ending the funding, so that they're out there talking about big numbers like $180 billion invested in infrastructure when it's just a tiny fraction of that that's going to be spent in this actual parliament, never mind this budget year. So again, you look at the government saying, just trust us, change the tabling date of the main estimates, we're sincere, we want more openness, we want more transparency, and then every day in question period you've got ministers getting up and misrepresenting the amount of money that they're actually investing. And pick your issue. I mean, they're doing it on defense, they've done it on housing, they're doing it with childcare, they're doing it with a number of other issues, Madam Speaker. I could spend a full 20 minutes just listing the policy areas in which that particular kind of misrepresentation and lack of transparency is being executed daily by this government. So again, it makes you wonder, I think fairly, whether you can trust them when they say, here's the nice big shiny package of reforms that we want to bring in to make the estimates better, but we're just going to do this one little piece that actually helps us out first, and trust us, the rest will come. We heard that from the president of the Treasury Board, again, apparently quite sincerely at the beginning of the mandate. He came to the Access, Information, Privacy and Ethics Committee many times to say that he wanted to reform access to information laws in this country, that because he wanted a government that was open by default, and that the Prime Minister shared his view, and that was in his mandate letter, and that they were going to move forward with that. They were going to do a two-stage process on access to information. Well, incidentally, you don't need any process for access to information reform to disclose the number of staff in the Prime Minister's office and their salary ranges. You can just do it. So we didn't need to wait on reform for that. If they wanted to model the kind of open and transparent government that they foresee by changing the standing orders and changing the law, then they could start doing that tomorrow. In fact, they should have started doing it yesterday and well before, Madam Speaker. But they're not doing that. Not only are they not doing that now, but they're, in terms of the commitment by the President of the Treasury Board to have a two-stage access to information reform, so he made a couple little reforms, nothing in the law itself, but just administrative reforms. We waited a long time. In fact, we were supposed to be debating legislation in this House by now, changes that would change the access to information regime. And we're not, Madam Speaker. And not only are we not debating that now, but we're not going to be debating it anytime soon. That's an announcement made by the Minister himself, that the changes aren't coming. Not anytime soon, Madam Speaker. So again, the reason I raise this is because I think it's important, if you're being asked, if you're being given the just trust us line by a government who wants to change the estimates process in a way that would ultimately reduce scrutiny, unless you had a government acting in very good faith, then as an opposition party, it's your duty, not just on behalf of yourself, but on behalf of Canadians, to ask, can we trust the government on this? So when you take into account their behavior in terms of disclosing information under the current access regime, which they could do much more readily than they actually do, when you take into account their record on other issues where they've said, we're going to do this, and then they renege, I think any right-thinking Canadian would look at the record of the government and go, you know what? No, I think we need to stick with what we got until they're ready to bring in more of the package at the same time, so that some of those other elements that introduce more accountability and more transparency come with the other change. Because that change would be tolerable if the other measures were in place. And what's not tolerable is to move ahead with that alone and expect that somehow we're going to get openness and transparency from this government. I mean, we just saw today a vote on a way to make appointment processes more open and more transparent. And that didn't come out of nowhere. That came out of a catastrophe on the government's part, trying to nominate a candidate to become an independent officer of parliament and failing miserably to select a candidate that could be that could perform that function. Because in order to be an independent officer of parliament, you have to enjoy the confidence not just of the government, but of all the parties in parliament. And there are ways of establishing processes that would allow you to nominate candidates that could hold the respect of all the parties in parliament. We suggested one yesterday in our opposition day motion, and we watched the government, even after they criticized it and they said, look, here's the one thing that everything else is good, but here's the one thing we can't agree to. And we amended it to solve that problem for them. They still wouldn't support that motion, Madam Speaker. And then again, we hear, just trust us. Just trust us on the estimates reform. We're going to move ahead with this one little tiny piece of the whole package that, again, together actually makes a lot of sense. And you just trust us that we're going to follow up, Madam Speaker. It's not, it's just simply not believable. Well, I mean, on the access to information thing, for instance, we just heard recently that actually the Liberals' first 18 months in government, their track record on access to information is worse than the previous government's track record in their last 18 months of government, Madam Speaker. So it's just, we're just not at the point anymore, I think, where the just trust us line is adequate, Madam Speaker. And it's important to try and understand these documents better because there's significant things that end up happening within the context of the main estimates. When we talk about a lack of transparency, one of the consequences for these estimates in my home province is that the Coast Guard facility in Gimli, Manitoba, and in Kenora are going to be shut down. Well, an open and transparent government that was serious about having people understand what it was doing when it came to the finances of the country and the financial decision making and the financial decisions that it's making would have gone out and consulted with people in the community and made it clear. They wouldn't have buried it in a line item in the main estimates or in the budget. They would have gone out and they would have talked to people in the community about why, and it could be that government felt those services weren't effective. That's not what you hear if you talk to people in the community, who, with respect, Madam Speaker, I think know better than people here in Ottawa. I've asked before in this House, and I'll ask again, I'm curious to know how many of the 7 Liberal MPs from Manitoba knew before it was announced that those Coast Guard stations were going to be closed and what they did to lobby to make sure it didn't happen. Clearly, they failed if they made any effort at all, but it would be nice for people back home to know what it is that these Liberals are doing to represent people back home. There's a story that just broke in the Winnipeg Free Press about Canada 150 money that says clearly, a reporter who's followed the money, that Manitoba is not getting its fair share of the Canada 150 funding. Again, where are the 7 Liberals from Manitoba that ought to be advocating for us to make sure that we're getting our fair share? It wasn't until I raised the issue of the post-secondary institution strategic investment fund here in the House that we started to see at least some announcements being made in Manitoba under that fund. So I think it's right to ask, when we're talking about how the government spends its money, where the Manitoba Liberals are on those files and why it is that in a number of cases Manitoba has been consistently underrepresented in terms of its fair share of funding. It's another fair question to say, where is the federal government when it comes to meaningfully dealing with Omnitrax that has been holding, not doing its fair share in terms of the community in Churchill. Omnitrax, after getting a sweetheart deal to take over the railway, has been getting a lot of money in public subsidies, and that money's been going to Denver, Colorado. It hasn't been reinvested in that rail. Now there's a flood. The rail infrastructure is inadequate. The town of Churchill is in crisis because they can't get food and other supplies to a town, and we just haven't heard the kind of quick response that we need to in order to provide assurance to people in Churchill that they're not going to be left out in the cold by this government. So I say again, where are they? And where's the money when we're talking about estimates, and we're talking about a budget, Madam Speaker. So those are just some of the problems, and I think I appreciate my colleague from the Conservative Party bringing up the issue of estimates reform, because it is an important issue. It is something that we have to tackle. But I would emphasize that for me, what it comes down to when we talk about reform is sequencing that reform properly so that we ensure that all the way along, members of this House that are not in the government have the appropriate tools that they need in order to be able to hold the government to account. Because otherwise, we're in a position of having to trust them on reform. Now, there was an important reform issue this Parliament where the government had made a commitment. It was on electoral reform, Madam Speaker. And I think that speaks quite clearly to the character of the government and why it is that people on this side of the House can't trust that government. Because they made a black and white promise, Madam Speaker, that that 2015 would be the last election fought under the first past the post system. And when we talk about money, let's be clear, they spent a lot of money to break that promise, Madam Speaker. A lot of money to break that promise. They struck a special committee. The special committee traveled across the country, took the time of Canadians who weren't paid to go and testify at that committee, who were calling for action. If you had paid them for their time, because their time matters too, the bill would have been that much higher. And they came back and they put that report together, Madam Speaker, and it was tossed aside by the minister at the time. And then they had the gall, I think knowing already they had no intention of keeping that promise, Madam Speaker, to go out and spend literally millions of dollars on a bogus survey that was designed to obfuscate the issue and try and give them an out. Because the out they thought they had, which was the special committee, I guess they were hoping that opposition parties wouldn't work together, despite them saying that they want Parliament to be a place where people work together. The opposition parties went out, did that, showed them the way to keeping their own promise. And it's pretty wild, Madam Speaker, when you've got a Parliament where the opposition parties are working harder to keep government promises than the government itself. But that was the situation they had. That was the situation they had. And where opposition parties not only were working hard, but were willing to compromise in order to help the government keep its promise. And instead, they threw that out. They spent millions of dollars on a survey trying to hide the fact that there actually was the potential for consensus if somebody would show leadership, if a government would show leadership. Now, how would you get a government that shows leadership? Well, I imagine the process looks something like having the leader of a party promise during an election that they were going to do something, and then having it in the party platform, and then having candidates across the country repeat that promise ad nauseum, and then get elected to this place, and then actually follow through on the commitment, Madam Speaker. That's how you would do it. And that's exactly what Canadians did. So then to say that there was no consensus, or that there wasn't a government with a mandate to provide leadership on determining how to provide democratic reform was just obviously false, Madam Speaker. Nevertheless, they broke that promise. They let down all the many Canadians that elected them for that express purpose. And then they ask, when it comes to something as important as scrutiny of their spending, for us just to trust them, that they're going to get around to the rest of the program. If we just do this one thing that could possibly reduce the scrutiny of a government if it wasn't acting in good faith, in the face of all of the broken promises and everything else, Madam Speaker, that's what they're asking us to do. They shouldn't be surprised if the answer is no, we don't believe we can. So it's for at least those reasons and more that I haven't had time to get into, Madam Speaker, that the NDP will be opposing the main estimates.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I believe the NDP are being true to form in the sense of opposing, even though what they're proposing is something that is very good for all Canadians. My colleague from across the way challenged in regards to what it is that Liberal MPs in the province of Manitoba are doing for the province of Manitoba. And I could tell the member across the way as we have a very strong strong representation coming from the province of Manitoba in ensuring that the issues of Manitoba is in fact being raised at the cabinet table, in the caucus, and on the floor of this chamber in many different ways. Specifically, all I would suggest to the member, and these are the type of things in which the member across the way is voting for. He is voting against issues such as the Canada Child Benefit, in which thousands of children in Manitoba will benefit from it. He is voting against the middle-class tax cut that thousands of Manitobans benefited from. He is voting against the increases to the GIS, which thousands of Manitobans are benefiting by, Madam Speaker, and the list goes on. So when we talk about the main estimates and the type of things that this member is going to be voting on, he needs to be aware that he is taking away through his vote the opportunity for Manitoba to be a part of the national scene in which people are receiving great enhancements. We are doing things such as infrastructure that is making a difference for Canada's middle class and those that are aspiring from it. And the member across the way, along with his NDP cohorts, have made the decision that Canada is not going to have the type of activities that we are proposing within this budget, which will in fact enhance the lifestyle of all Canadians, including those that live in Manitoba. My question is, why is he opposing that?
A member for Elmwood Transcona.
The member's been in the House for some years now. I would encourage him to revise his speaking notes for the budget when he decides to get up and speak to the main estimates, because while it's true that there's a lot of money in the budget for some things, it's all backloaded to 10 years from now. The main estimates actually speaks to the spending this year, and the spending in the main estimates, as opposed to what's projected for 2027 or 2034 or 2058 in the budget, is far less, Madam Speaker.
Then comments, the honourable member for Sarnia-Lambton.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker, and I want to thank my honourable colleague for his speech and for his passionate work in the House, because he's advancing the cause of democracy by his common sense approach when he comes here and calls it like it is. And you know, my benchmark is from global business. I worked for several multinational corporations, and when it comes to budgets and estimates, you know, it was clear that we were able to go and look and to see all the money that was planned to be spent, to be able to drill down in the line items and know exactly what was going to be spent. And that's not possible in this government, because we have main estimates, we have supplementary estimates, we have supplements that come after the supplementary estimates, and there's absolutely no way for Canadians to understand how their taxpayer money is being spent. And so I would ask the member, how does that represent openness and transparency?
The honourable member for Elmwood Transcona.
Well, thank you very much for giving me an opportunity to return to the issue of estimates reform, because you're quite right, and I think that's not just an opinion of opposition parties. In fact, it's an opinion of the government, or at least the President of the Treasury Board, that the estimates process is quite convoluted, and it's shared by many people in civil society who are at the forefront of examining government spending. So then the question becomes, how do you change it? And it was promising initially to see the President of the Treasury Board present a kind of package for how we could have a better estimates process. I said in my speech, and I'll say again, that I think as a whole package, that looks pretty promising in terms of being able to get a better system that's more comprehensible for not just us here, but also for Canadians generally. So then, as always, the devil is in the details. How do you implement that? And so when the government says, here's this great package and it's got a number of reforms, actually most of which don't require standing order changes and would actually advance the cause of transparency and openness more than the simple change to the standing orders, but that's what they want to start with, and they want to start with that alone, then the issue of, do we trust them to follow through on the rest of the package is the question. And then you go to some of the examples I raised in my speech, where they've promised a two-stage reform, for instance, on ATI and not done it, where they promised democratic reform and launched a whole process that came to naught. And that's why you have to assess the character of the government. And when you do it based on the record, you come up with the answer that you can't trust them to go ahead with that one little piece first. You have to have more substantive reform that comes with it.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary and the Government House Leader.
Yes, thank you. Madam Speaker, you know, in the province of Manitoba, they have the estimates. The member would be very familiar with that. I served there, and under the estimates, what would happen is you present the budget, and then shortly thereafter, you start to debate the estimates. Now, I won't be critical of the NDP who reduced the number of hours from at one point of 240 hours of line-by-line debate down to about 100, and I think they might have reduced it further than that. I'll stay away from that for now. But in terms of, it seemed to be a proper procedure, and I'm wondering if my colleague from across the way would agree that what was happening in Manitoba with respect to having estimates being brought in after the budget is a good principle or not.
The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
So my understanding of the estimates process in Manitoba is that members get considerably more time with ministers to interrogate them about spending than we do here. So for instance, here, you're lucky to get a minister at committee for an hour or so. In Manitoba, they just went through an estimates process where ministers were before committee for days, they were before committee being asked questions. If the member is recommending that we adopt a model like that here, then I'd be quite interested in hearing more about that proposal. I think there's many members in the chamber here who would love to have a minister before committee for days, because he's quite right that there's a lot of departmental spending. Departments are very large, and it's difficult. So for instance, Madam Speaker, we're debating the main estimates here in the chamber tonight for 4 hours, and that's the sum total of the main debate on the main estimates. Some committees will have got a minister to examine their spending. Probably not much more than for an hour, Madam Speaker. That's not actually a lot of time. So he's right to notice that there are substantive differences between the estimates process here in Ottawa and in Manitoba. Manitoba grants far more access to ministers during that process than is done here. So I take that as a point of interest, Madam Speaker. Perhaps it's something we'll return to.
Comments? The honourable member for Red Deer Lacombe.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I appreciate the words of my colleague from the NDP. He and I have served together on a committee, notably the Ethics Committee, for the better part of the last 2 years, and he brought up some of the issues that we faced on that committee. The committee has actually done excellent work. All members from all parties in this House have actually done excellent work. We've made recommendations on changing several pieces of legislation, the Information Act, the Privacy Act. We're now undergoing a study of PIPEDA as well, and the government actually has stated quite clearly that they have no intention of actually bringing back any of that legislative changes in response to any of the committee reports that we put forward. And my question to the colleague, and he brought it up in his speech, is how can we in good faith, when the estimates process is again up for debate by this Liberal government as something that they want to change, how can we in good faith know that they're going to keep their word when they haven't kept their word on anything? And when they want to change the process of how this House works, they can't even nominate a new commissioner. They can't even get that process right. So I'm wondering if my colleague thinks that they can get any process right.
The honourable member for Elmwood-Transcona.
Well, you know, I'm a very hopeful person, so I'll hope that they can, then they just haven't yet, but it remains to be seen, and it's up to the government to make good on that hopeful remark. It is frustrating, and I'll maybe just examine another angle of my frustration with the position of the government in respect not just to access to information, but I think it makes the point well. We hear often when it's convenient for the government that they appreciate the work of committees and that they want to send things out to committee and they want to have it studied, and that's a great virtue. I mean, they didn't feel that way about the infrastructure bank because they didn't want to break that off and actually have a committee have more time to look at it, so they kind of cherry pick. They like the work of the committee on Bill S-217, which we voted on earlier. They kind of cherry pick when they like the work of a committee and when they don't. Interestingly, the work that we've done on the Access to Information, Privacy and Ethics Committee generated, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but 2 unanimous reports. One on access to information reform, and it was a commitment of the minister that he would bring forward legislation this spring, which he has subsequently changed and not given a new date by which he will bring that information in. And we also had a unanimous report on reform to the Privacy Act. And in no case have they taken that work of the committee, unanimous work, which means 6 Liberals on the committee endorsed all of those recommendations. They haven't even picked one recommendation that they said they'd put into law, Madam Speaker. So again, their word's not worth much.